And so today we're going to talk about what makes companies valuable. What do I actually mean by what makes a company valuable? So something that we face quite often as marketers is we work with business owners that don't actually know why they're building their company. And that sounds ridiculous, right? It's like, why would anyone go and take all the time and effort to start a company and then not have any idea what the end goal is? And it seems shocking, but it's actually quite normal. There's a great book called The EMyth Revisited that talks about this. The EMyth in the title actually stands for the entrepreneurial myth. And the myth that Michael Gerber talks about in that book is that entrepreneurs don't start businesses. Technicians start businesses, and they start them after having an entrepreneurial seizure. That's like the opening lines in the book. So you've got a technician. The technician says, "Hey, I'm working for an idiot. This guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's booking me out for 900 Rand an hour, but he's only paying me 200 Rand an hour. How about I just start my own business, book myself out for 900 Rand an hour, and I'll be rich?" That's the thing, is technicians go and they start businesses, and you can go and check. We recently did a branding workshop with a company that works with a lot of business owners. And when I asked the question, are they entrepreneurs? Are they graduated? Who are these people that you work with? And she said across the board, they're non-graduated technicians that started their own companies. And that's the thing. You're a technician, you've got technical skills, you start the business, and you're all focused on technical. How do I produce the product? How do I deliver the service? It's all operational. It's not very entrepreneurial. The entrepreneurship lasts for about 5 or 6 hours until you've got the company registration and the domain registered. And then that's it. That's as far as the entrepreneurship goes. And then you become a technician again and you're working in your business. So you guys know the adage, work on your business, not in your business. This is it. This is where the rubber meets the road on that saying. So you've basically got technician, they start a business, they go into it thinking they're going to be rich. And the first thing they do is they stop being entrepreneurs and they start being technicians again. And no one's actually thinking about the business in terms of the value of the company. So there's another great book called Built to Sell. Built to Sell. If you can read Built to Sell and The EMyth Revisited, just read those two books. You'll probably be ahead of 90% of business owners in terms of understanding company value, in terms of understanding how businesses should be built. So once this entrepreneur started the business, the technicians now got the company, they go back to being technicians. And the first thing that you need to do if you really want to be serious about building a business that can run without you is you need to stop being the technician. So if Elon Musk wants to be very serious about Tesla, he needs to stop doing the engineering and start doing the entrepreneurship, which is what he does, right? He focuses on the marketing, he focuses on the brand building. Yes, he is involved in the design and engineering, but only so far as the product design portion. He's very involved in that, but he surrounds himself with really, really high-end technicians and coders, and he gives them the technical work, and he focuses on the vision of the company, the vision of the brand. He does call himself the chief engineer of SpaceX, but I'm pretty sure that he's got some pretty badass scientists and engineers that actually help him so that he can focus on things like contract negotiation, etc. Let's take another example, Mark Zuckerberg. If Mark Zuckerberg's really serious about Facebook, he needs to stop coding and start providing the vision for Facebook. Same thing in Xponent for that matter. If I'm very serious about building Xponent, I need to stop being operational and I need to start being strategic. And we try, obviously. And that's what I'm saying is it's not easy to do that because someone needs to take care of the technical details. And so to get back to the point of today's talk, it's what makes a business valuable. And just recently, we did a discussion with an entrepreneur. They've got two businesses. And I asked him the simple question, what's your exit strategy? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He's like, no, I'd never thought that far. And our job as marketers, or at least in Xponent, something that makes us a bit different is we don't only think about selling the product. We actually think about the entrepreneur's life cycle. Where are they going with this business? And the point of marketing and branding is to build value outside of the inherent value of the transaction, okay? So we're going to look at these 8 points. This is from the guy who wrote Built to Sell, John Werlow. He also started a company called the Value Builder System. And this is directly from the Value Builder System, which is another book that he wrote that you can buy, or you can run one of their programs. I'm sure people can just Google search Value Builder System and they'll find John Werelow's business. Very, very interesting. So what they do is they've got this sort of scorecard approach, and they've identified 8 elements that you can work on to make your business more valuable. So first things first is obviously financial performance. That's obvious, right? How profitable is the company, and how good is the bookkeeping and the record keeping? And we all know you walk into a business and more often than not, the companies don't keep proper records of transactions. I don't know if you guys know this, but I've been through a couple of mergers and acquisitions, and I've looked at a lot of companies, I've analyzed a lot of businesses, and it is actually quite shocking to see how poorly the basics are kept in place. What do I mean by the basics? I mean, who are my customers? Do they have a first name? Do they have a last name? Do they have a telephone number? Do they have an email address? You'll know the first thing I tell you is be thorough when you're setting up a client account. You need to add as much detail as possible, because if you don't do it in the beginning, people just forget. They just forget. Very simple. So yes, the financial performance of the business is important, but also how efficacious, I think is the right word. How efficacious have you kept the books? How thorough have you been with record keeping? Things like KYC, right? Know your client. Have you got the client's details in place? Have you got the signed contracts in place? Have you got all of their contact details captured? Have you got all of your suppliers' contact details captured? Do you keep them up to date when they send you an address update? Things like that are very, very important when you're looking at selling the business later on. So going back to what makes a company valuable, well, why do you want a valuable company? Because you need an exit strategy as an entrepreneur. Most of the time, you're trying to build a company. You're using the company's income to fund your lifestyle while you're young enough to work and you still have energy to be in that high pressure situation. And then you switch over and you say, okay, I want to retire now. I want to sell this company, or I want to hand it over to my kids. And you've got an exit strategy, but it's very vague. Okay. It's a vague idea. Okay, I want to hand this over to my kids, or I want to sell this company. And unfortunately, most entrepreneurs get to that stage in life and then they say, damn, I built this company the wrong way. Now it's not really a saleable item. What happened to my retirement? And then you've got entrepreneurs that have to work until they're 70 or 75 to properly exit. Not only that, even if you were to bring in your children or you've got a succession plan, if you haven't set up the company, then you are the problem. Right? You're the person with all of the knowledge locked into your head. Your memory is fallible, so you can't remember all the deals that you did and all the reasons why you did things 10 years ago. And so it becomes really important to do the very, very basic things like record keeping and transaction, like really making the transactions very clear when you're doing the bookkeeping. In any case, the point of building a valuable company is to have an exit strategy. Do I want to sell the company? Do I want to get an investor later? Do I want to hand it over to my kids? Well, you don't want to hand them a crappy business. You don't want to hand them a business that they've now got to jump in and try and figure out the mess. You want to hand them a company that's running properly, that's been built in the right way. And so these 8 steps are the things that you look at when you try and build a company that's valuable and that's worth handing over and that has a proper succession plan in place. So obviously financial performance, not only the profitability, but also the record keeping, and then growth potential. How did the company grow in the past? But also, what new markets could I go into? And we'll talk about hands-off matrix one day. It's one of those classic 4 squares. You've got 4 blocks where you look at growth potential, and it's something like market penetration, as in, can I serve more people in my existing market? Then you get market development, which is, can I go and find a new market for the same product? There's product development. Can I serve the same market with new products? Or then there's diversification, where you're just saying new product, new markets. We're just going to do something new in a new space. Growth potential could also be strategic. It's like a company would want to buy your business, but they've got a product that they want to sell to the existing clients. Or they want to buy your business because you've got a product you can sell to their existing clients. So there's a lot of different ways that you can express growth potential. But usually that's a really big factor. Like, how much can this company still grow? Because no one wants to buy a company that's already at maximum capacity, right? You want to buy something and grow it and make more out of it. Then the Switzerland structure. What does this mean? So it's the company's independence on a single customer, supplier, or employee. There's a classic book called Porter's 5 Forces. But essentially what it means is You don't want to be dependent on a single customer or even 2 or 3 customers for all of your income. You don't want to be dependent on a single supplier or a small number of suppliers for any of the inputs that you need to do the work that you're doing. And you don't want to be reliant on a single employee to make the business run. So in other words, the Switzerland structure is all about being independent from external forces and about not being reliant. So in other words, you want redundancy to avoid critical points of failure. That's really what it's about. Then number 4, monopoly control. Now, legally speaking, most monopolies are not a good thing. It's actually illegal to have an illegal monopoly, except for the ones that are legal, which is a lot of them. So like, for example, Eskom would score really high on this monopoly control score because they have a legal monopoly. The government decides how much they charge for energy, and only Eskom is allowed to supply it. But there are other ways to get legal monopolies. Which ways can we get legal monopolies? The one is to build a brand. Not only Apple is allowed to sell Apple. They've got a monopoly on selling Apple. Another good way to get an imperfect monopoly, but still a monopoly, is to be the first ranked in Google search. If you are the number 1 ranked page on Google, what percentage of the inquiries are going to come to you? 90? 95? So that's an imperfect monopoly, but a monopoly nonetheless. Another way to have a monopoly is through things like patents and intellectual property. If you've got a patent or a copyright on a specific product or process, then that is your process. Only you are allowed to use it. That is what a patent is, at least for a certain amount of time. And then finally, there are some other forms of monopoly, and that would be things like proprietary processes. So Xponent, for example, has SOPs. We keep those SOPs in a certain system, and that defines how we do things. And only we can do it that way. Other people could try to copy us, but it would just take very long for them to get there. So until they get to copy our process and figure out how we're doing things, it's going to be very difficult for them to do it exactly the way we do it. And a good example of that is things like Sasol, where they use different chemical processes to produce things. Those chemical processes are not patented, but it's just so difficult to get it to work that no one else has been able to really make it work. And the amount of debt you've got to put in, when I say debt or capital you've got to put in to copy it, doesn't make sense. Another form of an imperfect monopoly is by building a capital moat. An example of that would be if you've got a manufacturing business or something like that, you've just built the company so big that it's not worth it for anyone else to actually invest the amount of capital that you've got invested to compete against you, because it would cut the market share in both companies. So the amount of capital you've got tied up in capital equipment and stock could become a monopoly, because who else wants to take out 100 million rand so that they can be second best at what you're already doing very well? Yes, to it.
Sorry, Baz. Is it a monopoly as well, being your competition in the sense of you supply them with your product and sell your product?
That's another imperfect monopoly. A good example of that would be if you own a component product that's ubiquitous. So a good example of that would be the Taiwanese microchip. They don't make all the microchips in the world, but for their market segment, they are the only company in the world that can make those very advanced microchips. They make it for everyone. They do it for NVIDIA, they do it for AMD, they do it for Intel, they do it for all the big ones. So they essentially have a worldwide monopoly on really advanced microchips. Remember what I said about a capital monopoly, right? Just the amount of time, effort, money, everything that went into building that company. The whole country is basically geared towards that. They built an entire university just to train people to do what that company does. So it's entire cities that have been dedicated towards this one product. And there are examples of this all over, right? If you look at China, for example, China's got a steel mill, the biggest steel mill in the world. It's so big, they have their own port, not a bay. They built their own port where entire ships dock just to load steel. And yes, they own the ships too. They built an entire hotel. Darian can tell you about this. They built an entire hotel. I'm not talking about a small hotel. I'm talking about a skyscraper just to house the guests that come in, whether it's suppliers or customers or whatever. How do you compete against that? They've got a monopoly. Their steel is cheaper because they're just bigger. There are other more nefarious ways of doing it, like Standard Oil, for example. They did sort of similar stuff, just buying up all of the competitors, really. and slowly standardizing oil. And energy is usually something where that happens quite regularly. But yeah, that's monopoly control. We can have a whole talk about monopoly control, but basically it's like you get imperfect monopolies and perfect monopolies, and they sort of split up into different things. But for the most part, in what we're trying to do, we're saying branding is a really good way to build a monopoly, especially if the brand is protected through trademark, intellectual property, and then processes. Those are really easy things that any entrepreneur can apply to give them more of a monopoly control on how they operate. Moving on from there, the hub and spoke problem. And this is probably the most problematic. The one that I see more often than any of the others is the dependence of the company on its owners. And so for me, this hub and spoke problem and the Switzerland structure, they're very similar problems, because I don't see the owner in the capacity of being the managing director in the business as being the same person. Yes, it's the same human, but they're playing two separate roles. They're the shareholder, but they're also the managing director. And I don't think those should be conflated. And so the question becomes, how dependent is the company on the business owner? Let's look at Xponent, right? How dependent is Xponent on me being here? I'd say we're actually doing pretty well. If I left for a month, there'd be some hiccups, but the company would run, right? And the way that I measure the success of this is, if the owner of the business wasn't involved, in other words, complete air gap, no conversation, no discussion, would the company be better off when they came back? And there's sort of levels to this, right? So first level would be no, the company would be worse off. Clients would leave, suppliers would not get paid. Then there's a second level, which is it'll just kind of stay the same. It'll just be the same. It'll just tick over. And then finally, there's a sort of a highest level, which is, oh, this company won't only be the same, it'll actually be better. It will have signed new clients, new suppliers would have been developed, cheaper products would have been bought instead of the stuff we had done before. In other words, the business development and the payment structures and everything is actually baked into the company from the beginning. And more importantly, there's control structures across the board to make sure that people are acting in an ethical and a legal way. So there's no fraud internally because of control mechanisms or lack of control mechanisms. So the hub and spoke problem is real. This is a very, very big business because they're just really difficult problems to solve, right? How do you make sure that there's a control mechanism for every transaction without the owner signing off the checks and signing off the transactions? So that means you need to put someone in place that does the banking, but that person can't be the person that approves the transactions, because then they'll just approve transactions to themselves, right? And they'll manipulate contracts. And so it becomes really difficult to put in enough checks and balances so that companies run without being at very high risk of fraud. And so this is really one of the hardest problems to solve. But to some extent, it's also the easiest to improve. Because there's such a big scope, there's a lot that you can remove or that you can improve before you get to those really nitty-gritty critical ones like transaction approval and purchase approvals and stuff like that. Okay, then there's the customer score. So what do we mean by the customer score? And this is essentially connected to monopoly control when it comes to brand. So this becomes, how willing is the company's customers to recommend them to other customers? So in other words, how referable is this business? Are people willing to refer you to the company or not? And if not, why not? How do we improve that? And usually it's because there isn't a good brand or there's issues with customer service. So even if you have a brand, the customer service might be poor, and so the brand is taking knocks or whatever because of that. I think it's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go too deep into that. And then the valuation teeter-totter. Now this, again, speaks to the monopoly control section that I was talking about earlier. And the valuation teeter-totter, it's a stupid name, but it's actually a pretty cool concept. So if you're going to buy a company and you're putting capital down, let's say you're buying a company for 10 million Rand, just as an example. Okay, I'm putting 10 million Rand down. How long will I have to run this company before the profits have made up the purchase price of the business? In other words, how long is my return on investment window? So let's say I make R1 million a year off of this business in profits. I'm not talking about turnover. I'm talking about profits. If I made R1 million a year, it would take me 10 years to make my R1 million back. Now, yes, then I still had the business, so I still have the R1 million a year, but my ROI window would be something like 10 years. And if you look at business valuation, you look at things like EBIT times a multiplier of 1 or 3 or 6 or whatever the case may be. And that multiplier that you're using is based on the score that you can get out of looking at these 8 metrics. So the valuation teeter-totter is really asking, how much capital do I have to tie up in order to earn the profit of this business? Does that make sense? You guys understand what I'm saying? Okay, I'll get back to the valuation teeter-totter because this is actually very important. Okay, then looking at recurring revenue, this is an obvious one. People like businesses where there's a guaranteed income in the future. I mean, why wouldn't you like that? I actually think it's a bit overrated in today's world because software companies, I mean, I've seen lots of software companies and internet businesses with good recurring revenue, but they're just not profitable because it costs them too much to grow. It takes too long to recoup the income. So I personally prefer blended models where you've got a recurring component and an upfront component, but that's just personal experience that's taught me that. So in closing, I would say these 8 elements are not perfect in any way. Remember what I say, all of this is just a perspective to understand something better. It's not the be all and end all. It's definitely not the only way to look at business valuations and making companies valuable. But this is a really, really good start if you wanted to figure out, how do I make a company valuable? More importantly, for the account executives, when you're talking to a customer about their business, this is what you should be thinking about. This is how you think strategically about a client's business. And if you can talk to a client and say, yes, we want to fix your marketing, but that's just one little part, financial performance, that's just one little part of what I see for your business. And try this next time you're in a meeting with a client. Obviously, be delicate and you need to approach it correctly, but try and ask an entrepreneur, even someone you know in your personal lives that you know owns a business. Go and ask them a question and say, hey, what's your exit strategy with your business? Have you thought about that? And you'll get a range of responses. Some people get angry, like, I'll never sell my business, because they're so invested in it, right? They've spent so much blood, sweat, and tears building it that they just don't want to let go. Some people will say, oh no, I've never thought about it. I'm too busy with day-to-day operations. Some people might say, hey, I've actually thought about this quite deeply. I plan to sell it. And then the follow-up question is, cool, how valuable do you think it is? And if they can't give you a straight answer, like I know exactly to the cent to the cent according to my own valuation metrics, but I'm always monitoring Xponent's value, because if I'm not building a valuable asset, then what the hell am I doing? And I would be doing the team a disservice if I didn't build the company in such a way that it is saleable and investable at any given point. I've never hidden the fact from the team that I don't want to do this forever. But at some point, I do want to sell this company. And I haven't hidden that from the team. I don't think that that's controversial. I think it's actually a good thing. If all of us can work together towards building a valuable asset, then it means that it can be rolled up into a bigger group. You can move into a bigger role if that's what you want in your life. You can get a bonus payout when the company does sell. You can take a larger position with the new company that buys it. You know, there's so many ways that you could do it. But more importantly, it's not that I want to necessarily sell the company. I want the company to be investable. And that's the same thing, because if you're asking someone to invest in your business, you're basically selling them the idea of the business, and they need to believe that the company is going to bring their money back to them, like with some friends, right? Let's open up to questions. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments?
I would say this also ties back into like our marketing as well. If this is our goal, business focused, I do think that like you could reconcile that with us being time merchants, because it's one thing to know this, but then to tie this back to branding separately and marketing separately and business development separately doesn't make sense until you put all of those pieces together. And I feel like this is essentially what you get. You give people the capacity to not only have an exit strategy, but actually work on their business.
So, John, I'll address that quickly by saying, look at marketing. All of the products and services that we sell, put into this matrix sum, and that was consciously and subconsciously done through time and lots of mistakes, I think. So, the marketing side of things that's all about financial performance and growth potential, but also about this hub and spoke problem. Because if you can remove the marketing, lots of business owners are the salesperson as well, or that business owner will be the salesperson as well. So like, I'm the best salesperson in Xponent. If I wasn't out there selling all the time, I think we would make some sales, but we wouldn't grow nearly as fast as we were growing, because I know the business so well that I can sell it very well. So if you can make a deal flow that's independent from the owner, that's actually fixing the hub and spoke problem, fixing things like giving you a bit more monopoly control. It's fixing a bit of the Switzerland structure because you're not as dependent on a single customer. You're giving growth potential, you're doing financial performance and recurring revenue to some extent, because in some cases you won't get recurring revenue if you're selling products because they don't work on an SLA or something like that. But you can prove that the revenue generation is a lot more dependable, that you've got deal flow in place. Let's look at branding. What does the branding do? Well, branding actually helps for growth potential. Branding also works for the Switzerland structure, and in many ways that a lot of people don't actually think about. So if you're a nice brand and you're a well-known brand, you can attract better employees, right? If someone said to you, I can get a bigger salary for working for Fisker, but I've also got an offer from Tesla that's similar but a bit less, I think a lot of people will opt to work for Tesla just because it's a better brand, right? Who wouldn't want to say on their CD, I work for Tesla, right? Same thing with suppliers and customers. You're actually building a better deal flow by having a strong brand, and you're also building better supplier relationship. Because if you're a supplier and you're like, hey, one of my customers is Tesla, but you feel good about that. You feel strong because you're one of the suppliers. You put it on your website, right? You're like, look, this is one of our clients. They choose us. So that actually helps with your Switzerland structure quite a bit. If you've trained your people what the brand is for and what it stands for, then you're actually removing the dependence of the owner, because the owner doesn't need to teach every person one at a time. But there's a culture in the business that exists outside of the owner of the company. Yes, John?
So I think that's a very important thing to touch on. We often use the strategic objective and the tactical goal in all of our briefs, but then communicating that internally to ourselves as to what is our operational strategic objective, and I think in part, it's also to allow our business to do this very same thing.
Yep, exactly. And then if you think about e-learning, what does the e-learning do for us? Well, e-learning helps with Switzerland structure to some extent, because you can actually train employees quickly, so you can onboard and offboard employees and suppliers and so on easily. Monopoly control, it actually helps with that because you're capturing your processes in an asynchronous format or an independent format. So the way the company operates, that proprietary knowledge is captured and crystallized, and so that can actually be used to generate some sort of imperfect monopoly. And then the hub and spoke problem, if you've got e-learning in place, that actually replaces the owner in a massive way, because they can train staff to do the jobs that they can't do themselves. Valuation teeter-totter, that actually helps as well. If you've got well-trained staff, then you don't need to tie up as much capital, because your staff members can actually sell the products without you. And then also recurring revenue, because you can actually help or train your staff on how to deliver for the client. And then finally, the domains, hosting, websites, technical, and also the coding that we do. A lot of that is about building systems that can operate without the business owner. And so that solves the hub and spoke problem to some extent. If you've got fast page load speeds and your website's kick-ass, you've got better financial performance and better growth potential. And to some extent, you've got a monopoly control over your domain. So that's where the SEO comes in and all of those sorts of things. So everything that we do in Xponent is actually geared towards these 8 metrics. That's something we try and help our customers with. And that is what makes us a different sort of company from just any marketing agency. Is that we're not just thinking about, how do I market my client's business? How do I sell the product? Yes, that's very important. We want to do that as well. But we're also thinking about, how do I make this company valuable? How do I do what I'm doing in such a way that I'm considering these 8 metrics that I can actually use to build a valuable company that's going to have longevity and will have an exit strategy for the business owner. And simply by bringing up the exit strategy for the business owner early on in the relationship changes the entire dynamic that you have with your customer or with your client. Okay, and that's my talk on how to make a company valuable. I hope you guys enjoyed it.